Sì. Cominciamo. Welcome. Welcome to all present here in the room. Welcome to all joining us online. Welcome to the Royal Netherlands Institute in Rome. My name is Susanna de Beer and I'm the Director of Ancient Studies and Classical Receptions here at the Institute. A warm welcome to our last research dialogue of this academic year. This year's series has been dedicated to one of the core themes of current research at the KNIR. Throughout the domains and time periods we study here, dedicated to very broadly defined colonization and colonialism, imperialism, or what we may term the more problematic and contested elements of Rome's widespread legacy. We've actually just recently started a research group, which also includes a KNIR postdoc, on the project The Classical Roots of Early Modern and Modern Colonization to study exactly this dynamic. And I'm happy to have seen that many of this project join us online. So far within our research dialogue series, we've had contributions as diverse as the assimilation of Mesoamerican gods in visual theory of religion, the ecologies of Italian colonialism, fascist enterprises in North and East Africa, and only 1 month ago, Professor Barbara Goff spoke about why post-colonial classics matter. And we're very pleased and honored that for today's session, we found Elena Giusti from the University of Warwick prepared and willing to share her research with us. Especially since it is already a very busy week for her, organizing an important conference later this week on classics and Italian colonialism, together with Samuel Agbamu at the Museo della Civiltà here in Rome, next Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. Elena Giusti is Associate Professor of Latin Language and Literature at the University of Warwick. She is the author of Carthage in Virgil's Aeneid, Staging the Enemy under Augustus, and has published extensively on Latin and Greek literature and thought. She's currently writing a monograph entitled Rome's Imagined Africa, with courtesy of the British Academy, and co-editing the forthcoming Cambridge Companion to Classics and Race, together with Rosa Andujar and Jackie Murray. Very recently, she also published an article on Africa and the making of classical literature, on decolonizing Greco-Roman literature syllabi, from which you can tell that Elena Giusti also represents an important voice in the discussion of how to decolonize the classics. And this is certainly a discussion that is very much alive in many classics departments all over the world, and that is equally relevant for our institute, that from its origin onwards has been and still is so intricately connected with the ancient legacy of Rome and its many receptions. Today, Elena Giusti will speak about Africa's shifting landscapes, Rome's imagined geographies of empire. And we are looking forward very much to her ideas. Yes, it's time to start. Thanks for the cue. But before giving her the floor, a reminder that this lecture series is not called a dialogue without a reason, which means that after the lecture of about an hour, there will be plenty enough time for questions, discussion, and sharing ideas all among each other. So, Elena, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for this kind introduction. Thank you so much for inviting me here. This is very much work in progress. So I started working on this realistically, like October, November of last year. So I'm really grateful for your thoughts. Is this okay? I'm too short, so that's what happens most of the times. So I'm really glad to be presenting in my hometown. It's really a privilege. So thank you, Susanna. Okay, so shall I use the clicker or this one? Okay. Yep. In his 1988, The Invention of Africa, Congolese philosopher and classicist Valentine Yves Mudimbe called for a detailed study of Greek and Latin writers' influence on the European invention of Africa. Writing shortly after Frank Snowden Jr.'s Blacks in Antiquity and Before Color Prejudice, and more or less at the same time as Martin Bernal's Black Athena, Mudimbe declared himself skeptical of the simplicity with which Frank Snowden rejected the application of race to the Greco-Roman experience on the basis that Greeks and Romans were only culturally biased and attached no special stigma to color. The objectification of Africa, and even, Mudimbe seems to imply without using this terminology, the racialization of Africa, is intimately connected with the process of binding the continent in its supposed alterity, according to the grid of Western thought and Western imagination. The employment of skin color, no earlier than in the late Middle Ages of early modern period, as the signifier for this constructed alterity of Africa, is only an after effect of the continent's reification, the origin of which may be found both in the ancient Greek imagination, but more crucially in the Roman, as it goes hand in hand with Rome's imperial and economic expansion. So in my project that is currently entitled Rome's Imagined Africa, I single out the turn between the late Republic and the early Empire as a crucial moment in the history of Europe's imagination of Africa. And in this period, I look at representations of what is only a specific area of what will later become the continent, because ancient Africa or Libya only included territory belonging to today's countries of Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya, to which in imperial times, sometimes the region of Ethiopia was added, which is very hard to fix, but it stretches over the modern states of Sudan and Ethiopia. The representations of these areas and their inhabitants produced in this period, I'd like to argue in continuity with Mudimbe, crucially influenced the early modern period and its age of explorations, and they functioned as a kind of blueprint for the racialized construction of Africa that would serve as the backbone for the continent's colonial exploitation. So within this relatively short period, which goes from the middle of the 1st century BC to the end of the 1st century CE, I have divided the discussion into two main areas in which the reification of Africa manifests itself in the literature. And those are the organization of space and the representation of people. But this division is quite artificial, especially because many Greco-Roman thinkers subscribed to the theory known as environmental determinism, most famously expressed in the Hippocratic treatise, Airs, Waters, Places, according to which it was the specific features of a land, its landscape, but most especially its climate, which determined both the physical and the behavioral features of the inhabitants. So to give you a famous example of environmental determinism as expressed by Hippocrates while evoking representations of what could be the African space as described in other authors, Hippocrates states that where the land is bare, waterless, rough, oppressed by winter storms and burned by the sun, there you will discover people who are hard, lean, showing obvious joints, vigorous and hairy. And in such natures, there are fierce energy and vigilance, as well as stubborn, independent characters and tempers, wild rather than tame. In the arts, they have considerable sharpness and intelligence, and in war, exceptional courage. The same ideas would be re-echoed in the representations of Africa and its inhabitants, presented, for example, by Sallust in his treatise on the war against the Numidian king Jugurtha, where the asperitas, which means roughness or wildness of the African territory, mirrors the asperitas of its autochthonous inhabitants. So in a brief ethnographic passage at the opening of Sallust's digression on Africa, the historian presents a direct juxtaposition and a cause and effect connection between the territory and the people in what sounds more like the jotted down notes of an explorer rather than the detailed tactical emphasis expected from a historian of military conflicts. So here the type of people who inhabit Africa and who recall in their characteristics the earlier portrait of Jugurtha are presented as physically robust because of their need to survive in such a hostile landscape. So he writes, sea, ferocious, no harbors, soil, fertile in crops, good for livestock, unproductive of trees. From the sky and in the ground, scarcity of water, type of humans, healthy body, fast, enduring of hardship. So I will come back to Sallust's representation of Africa, but before I do, I'd like to briefly recap the story of Rome's relationship with Africa from the time of the Punic Wars up to the Neronian era. And by doing so, I wish to show how the history of its representations in the literature is closely linked with the history of its role as a crucial space of Roman imperium from the mid-Republican age onwards, with a special hinge, I think, around the consolidation and reorganization of space in the Augustan period, which is followed by attempts to stretch its boundaries in the age of Nero. From here, I want to focus on two specific case studies of representations of African landscapes and boundaries in Sallust and in Seneca, two authors respectively from the late Republican and from the Neronian period. Both Sallust and Seneca, I argue, present Africa as a place of shifting and contested boundaries, ready to be given territorial organization by external people, but at the same time actively resisting this very imposition of fixed limits, whether it comes from the Romans, the Greeks, or the Carthaginians. In the close of the lecture, I want to briefly look at what Mudimbe called geographies of monstrosity in Greco-Roman texts, which filtered in interesting ways into early modernity and beyond. So by the time we reach the 1st century CE, Ovid establishes with a jingle of certainly excessive confidence that the space of the city of Rome, the urbs, has become equal to the space of the entire known world, orbis. There is here a clear nod to the prophecy pronounced by Jupiter in the first book of the Aeneid, where Jupiter reassures Venus that he shall give the Romans no limits of either space nor time, but rather a command, imperium, and indeed an empire, sine fine, which means both with no end and with no boundary. A similar statement is re-echoed in the preface of the achievements of the divine Augustus, the res gestae divi Augusti, listed and paraded at the entrance of the mausoleum where the emperor was buried, and presented as those deeds by which he made the whole world subject to the rule of the Roman people. But in comparison to Virgil and Augustus, Ovid, who is inserting this distich to cap the praises of no other deity than Terminus, the god of boundaries, emphasizes how the ecumenic dimension of Augustan peace is predicated upon the establishment of fixed limits, limite certo, onto the lands of other people. As Claude Nicolet observes in what is now a classic study on the organization of space in the Augustan period, the age of the first emperor was not so much a period of expansion in the history of Rome, but of territorial organization and consolidation of ecumenic power, which spurred a renewed need for acquisition of ethno-geographic knowledge. This epistemic shift in the conceptualization of the oikumene and of Rome's central place within it was signaled both by the public display of the emperor's marble memoirs and their discursive representation of conquest, the res gestae, but at the same time also by a mysterious map initiated by Augustus's first in command, Vipsanius Agrippa, which exhibited in the Porticus Vipsania a graphic representation of Rome's ecumenic achievements to match the emperor's own words, which included plentiful of commentary as well. Now, we don't know what actual form this map took. Nicolet suggests that the map might have followed Eratosthenes in shaping the world as a chlamys, that is, a rectangle rounded at its two ends and bounded by Thule in the north and by the Cinnamon country in the south, and dividing it into 24 regions, which would recall Eratosthenes' Phragidus. On the other hand, Trousset in 1993 has proposed, on the basis of a passage of Pliny, that the three regions of the world may have been depicted separately on three different walls of the porticus. Less likely is perhaps the hypothesis of a rounded shape on imitation of the circular world maps of the Ionian geographers. But whatever form the map took, Pliny the Elder testifies that Agrippa's aim was to display the whole world for viewing to the world in a proper public spectacle offered by Agrippa and by the emperor jointly, both to the city of Rome and to anyone from all around the world who might be visiting the place that the map posited as its center. Writing his De Architectura in this very period, Vitruvius probably refers to this map of Agrippa when mentioning for the very first time in Latin chorographies of the world, which he claims were both painted and annotated. A latent text, which is derived from a single 13th century manuscript entitled the Divisio Orbis Terrarum, credits Augustus himself for having shown to everyone for the very first time the tripartite division of the world into Europe, Asia, and Africa, or Libya, through a chorography which may or may not be the same as Agrippa's. And we know that the emperor also left a brief account of the whole empire, Breviarium Totius Imperii, which included counts of citizens and soldiers stationed throughout the empire, of money in the treasury and revenues in arrears. Under Augustus's centralization, as Tacitus puts it, everything, legions, provinces, fleets, became joint and interconnected. In light of such a political and cultural program, Nicolet observes, it is also not a coincidence that the most complete geographic work handed down from antiquity, the geography of Strabo of Amasia, is also from the Augustan period. Although Strabo opens his work by presenting geography as a proper science and as such as a branch of philosophy, he also makes it clear in more than one programmatic statement that his enterprise will be of use to politicians and military commanders. In literary representations of the Roman domain under Augustus, Africa or Libya plays a special role, I think, as a space of Roman Empire and conquest and of previous Roman military conflict, having hosted not only wars against foreign enemies, but even more crucially, wars against fellow Romans. When Jupiter pronounces his prophecy of Roman dominion in Virgil's Aeneid, the narrative is set in Africa, in a mythical episode that serves as the Aition, the original cause for the historical conflict between Rome and Carthage, which pitted Europe against Africa in a continental conflict of global proportions in imitation of that clash between Europe and Asia that was part of the rhetoric of the Persian Wars. In the Res Gestae, viewers would have read of the advancement of the Roman armies at what the map of Agrippa must have shown to be the southern edges of the known world, up to the heart of the Ethiopian kingdom, the Res Gestae say, as far as the town of Nabata, to which Meroe is nearest. In another simultaneously literal and visual representation of empire, that is the ekphrasis on the shield of Aeneas, Virgil lists a race of nomads, which may be a byword for Numidians and no better specified Africans, whose loose clothing may indicate Carthaginians, as the first in the parade of conquered people, represented as solemnly walking in a long line to offer gifts to the emperor in the guise of Apollo. And when we get to the conceptualization of the Augustan ecumenic space as visualized in Strabo's geography, Africa serves as a remote location at the edges both of the oikumene and of its textual representation, as it is described at the very end of the work, just before the final praises to Roman conquest. Now, Africa had already entered the Roman literary imagination at the time of the first conflict between Rome and Carthage, but at that point, it was mostly the maritime context of the naval battles alongside the landscape of Sicily that was theater to many of the military operations that arguably filtered into the literary text of the period and their maritime settings, as it has been argued, for instance, for the Odyssea of Livius Andronicus, which is a Latin rewriting of Homer's Odyssey, and for the Bellum Punicum of Naevius, which is an epic poem on the First Punic War written by a veteran of the war. It was only with the second and the third wars against Carthage that Rome eventually brought her troops onto the African territory, and that exploration in the western regions of Africa was made possible by Rome's overtaking of the Carthaginians. The Greek historian Polybius, who had taken part in the military operations of the Third Punic War, claimed that it was first Alexander's conquest of Asia and then the Roman dominion over the remaining parts of the world that brought about the possibility to know better and more truthfully previously unknown regions. And for his part, he mentions having undergone journeys through Africa, Spain, and Gaul, as well as voyages on the seas that lie on the farther side of these countries. It was probably after the fall of Carthage in 146 BC that Polybius, and as mentioned by Pliny the Elder, undertook a naval expedition on the West African coast on behalf of Scipio Aemilianus up to and shortly beyond Mount Atlas for the purpose of observing that part of the world. That Polybius was interested in joining history writing with ecumenic geography is also evinced by his devoting a lost section of his histories, book 34, exclusively to geographical questions. And the Rhodian astronomer Geminus tells us that he also composed a separate work on the theory of zones under the title On the Inhabited Part of the Globe Under the Celestial Equator. Now, while it's unlikely that Polybius's geographical knowledge would have been much more than amateurish in contrast with professional geographers, his work stands out in the preserved history of Rome's geographical imagination as the first to show how the ecumenic afflatus of Roman Imperium gave the incentive to a very pragmatic kind of geographical description that would be usefully included in the writing of history. Although it has been doubted whether Rome's conquest of Carthage in 146 BC formally established a new province of Africa, as is often assumed in scholarship, the end of the Punic Wars certainly brought about the beginning of a different phase of Rome's involvement in the African territory. Velleius and Strabo unambiguously claim that after Carthage's fall, the African territory that had previously been under Carthaginian control became a province. And Appian reports that the Romans decided to destroy both Carthage and the cities that had sided with her in the war, while giving Carthaginian territory to the towns that had supported Rome, first and foremost Utica, where they decided to station a Roman governor to exact tribute from the population. Already in the aftermath of the Hannibalic War, Rome had appointed Massinissa, the king of the Massilians, eastern Numidians, to the former territory of Syphax, the king of the Massaicilians in western Numidia, merging the two territories under the joint kingdom of Numidia, with Cirta as its royal residence. After Massinissa's death in 148 BC, the organization of the Numidian kingdom was divided between his sons Micipsa, Gulussa, and Mastanabal by Scipio Aemilianus himself, and it would later be turned by Caesar in 46 BC into the new province of Africa, which was divided from the old by a boundary line called the Fossa Regia, the royal ditch. And this is the map. After Micipsa's death in 118 BC, the contestations over the divisions of the Numidian kingdom between his biological sons, Hayam-Salen and Herbal, and his adopted son, Jugurtha, and the eventually unsuccessful war that Jugurtha waged with Rome in an effort to curb Rome's control over Numidia, are famously the subject of a monograph by Sallust, written in the aftermath both of his governorship of the province of Africa Nova and of Caesar's death in 44 BC. In 40 BC, the old and the new Africas were united under the command of the triumvir Aemilius Lepidus, but it is only from the Augustan period onward that we can properly speak of a province of Africa Proconsularis that you see here in pink, which extended from the Ampsaga River, that's the modern Rumel River in the Constantine region of current-day Algeria, up to the altars of the Philaeni at the border with Cyrenaica, which is modern Ras Ali in current-day Libya, and he held their capital at Carthage, which was rebuilt and repopulated by Augustus under the name of Colonia Julia Concordia Carthago. It seems likely that much of the territory of the province began to be concentrated in immense estates of private landowners, if we have to believe the elder Pliny's testimony that Nero had 6 of these domini, who he says possessed half of Africa, put to death so that the territory could become part of the private riches of the emperor. Both the Jugurthine War, which is introduced by Sallust not just as a foreign conflict, but as the beginning of Rome's struggle against the insolence of the nobility, and even more crucially, the civil war between Caesar and Pompey between 49 and 46, which was partly fought on the African territory and narrated in the pseudo-Caesarian monograph De Bello Africo and in the Lost Historia of Asinius Pollio, turned Africa into one of the main theaters of the late Republican civil wars. As especially exemplified by Lucan's Neronian epic on the civil war between Caesar and Pompey, these conflicts made Africa enter Rome's literary imagination as an unavoidable landscape against which to pitch ideas of what it meant to be Roman in the late Republic and in the newly established imperial era, both in the confrontations between Romans and foreigners and in the face of the continuing struggles between different contrasting factions of Rome's body politic. The triumviral period and the age of Augustus continued to mark Africa as a space of military operation, already proved necessary under Caesar to provide grain supply to Rome and the Italian peninsula. The numerous triumphs ex-Africa from the province's governors that are reported in the Fasti Triumphales between 34 and 19 BC testify to a strenuous resistance to the settlers from the African people. The only one of these triumphs on which we possess some information, which is that of the proconsul Lucius Cornelius Balbus of Gades in 19 BC, recounted by the elder Pliny, suggests that Balbus went further south than any other governor in the region of Fezzan and paraded in Rome a long list of names and images, nomina ac simulacra, of various African people and cities besides Kidamus in the region of Sabrata and Garama, which was the old capital of the Garamantians. Following Balbus's expedition, there may have been a period of relative stability in the region up to the beginning of the 1st century CE, when a successful campaign led by the proconsul Lucius Pasenius Rufus in around 3 CE was followed by an ambush of the Nasamones, which led to the death of his successor, Lucius Cornelius Lentulus, and to a rebellion in 6 CE of Gaetulians and Muslimi against the joint forces of Juba II and of the proconsul Cossus Cornelius Lentulus, which is attested by an inscription from Leptis Magna. This conflict must have been the precursor of the better attested rebellion of Muslimi, Mauri, Garamantians, and Kiniti, which was led by the Berber leader Tacfarinas under the reign of Tiberius and narrated by Tacitus in his Annales. In the Augustan age, however, exploration and military intervention in Africa, as intended in the modern sense of the continent, pertained not just to the province proper, but also to the consolidation and expansion of Roman control around the newly created province of Egypt, which was annexed to the Roman Empire in the aftermath of the Battle of Actium in 30 BC. In particular, the first 3 Roman prefects of Egypt were engaged in serious conflict, both with the local Egyptian rebellions and with the kingdom of Meroe, as they tried to establish a firm border south of the province. The first prefect, the elegiac poet Gaius Cornelius Gallus, both dealt with revolts that had broken out in Aeropolis and in the Thebais, and he led an expedition into Ethiopia, establishing a garrison at Syene. In a trilingual inscription from the town of Philae, recording his military exploit, Gallus boasts of having taken his troops further south than any Roman or any Egyptian monarch. His successor, Aelius Gallus, embarked on an expedition to Arabia Felix in 25-24 BCE, during which time the Cushites attacked the Roman garrisons at Syene, Elephantine, and Philae, and Strabo says they pulled down the statues of Caesar. It is commonly thought that the famous Meroe head of Augustus, which was found in 1910 beneath a temple in the ruins of Meroe, should be recognized as one of those statues that were removed from Syene and brought to Meroe, placed under the ground so that the Meroites could step upon it as entering the temple. Gallus's disastrous operations were recovered by the prefect Publius Petronius, whose advancement as far as Napata, as we have seen, is recorded in Augustus's Res Gestae, and whose campaigns against Meroe are narrated in some detail in Book 17 of Strabo's Geography. With Petronius, the Roman border was settled at Hierasicaminos, about 80 kilometers south of Syene, where it seems to have remained stable for the next 300 years. Now, if we zoom in on literary representations of Africa, both at its geographical endpoints, so at the borders of Africa Proconsularis and at the Ethiopian border, and at the temporal extremes of this history, so the end of the Republic and the Neronian period, I think that a similar picture emerges of a land of undefined contours, a land that is described as ripe for war and conquest by its own nature. As Karen Green puts it, with reference to Sallust's representation of Africa that's included in a brief excursus of his Bellum Jugurthinum, this is a territory of shifting, unreliable boundaries, an ambiguity, a place whose relationship to the rest of the world has yet to be fixed or agreed upon. Interestingly, the reception of Sallust's excursus on Africa influenced representations of the world and of the continent up to the modern age. It gave rise to representations of the oikumene in the form of so-called TO maps, where TO also stands for Terrarum Orbis, which are found in circa 80 medieval manuscripts of the Bellum Jugurthinum and represented the earth as a circle, an O, with a T inscribed within it. More surprisingly, the influence of Sallust is still found in the 19th century, since abolitionist French historian Augustin Cauchin was able to suggest in 1863 that European colonialist and racist ideas about Africa depended upon the Bellum Jugurthinum, when he asks, what do we know about Africa's geography? Until very lately, the maps of Africa have been covered with two sentences, a vast desert, unknown countries, and many honest men remain persuaded with Sallust that this part of the world is an accursed region where the earth is sterile sands, the sun a devouring cauldron, and where the animal kingdom is represented by tigers and serpents, and the human species by ferocious and stupid varieties of the species of apes. Now, while I don't have time to go into the details of Sallust's excursus, it is worth highlighting a couple of its features that contribute to this kind of future reception. Sallust Africa is presented from the very start of his excursus as slippery and undefinable, because he says opinions vary as to whether it should be considered a third division of the world or else a part of Europe, and Sallust refrains from picking a side in this debate. Sallust also prefaces his account with the caveat that he shall exclude places and people that are less frequented because of the heat or rough terrain, as well as deserts, because he could not easily relate any reliable factual information about them. We're not told here which African regions and people he will omit, and readers would only surmise perhaps a reference to the equatorial zone. But immediately we are confronted with a picture of natural hostility, of unbearable heat and harshness, which any readers accustomed to environmental determinism would read as implicitly reflecting on the passionate and fierce character of the people living in this territory. These features are coupled with an evocation of deserted wastelands that simultaneously attributes a lack of human contact to both the places and their autochthonous inhabitants. By specifying that any possible information he may relate about these lands and people would be hard to verify, Sallust seems to be inviting his readers to infer that he's omitting stories that can, however, be found in other authors, such as those about marvelous creatures already related by Herodotus, upon which I shall touch shortly. Similar representations of the borders of Africa as an undefinable territory are found at the end of Strabo's description, who joins Libya and Ethiopia in being both lands verging on the unknown. Not unlike Sallust, Strabo also writes often that he shall refrain from reporting unbelievable stories about Africa, Thauma, of the kind that will become popular, as we shall see in later authors such as Pomponius Mela and Pliny the Elder. Now, a second notable feature of Sallust's account is that Africa is presented as a land where it is external colonists, and not just Romans, but especially Greeks and Carthaginians, as well as Medes, Persians, and Armenians, in a rather unique myth that he reports, who provide agricultural practice and urban organization to these people who were previously averse to cultivation, and they contribute to the foundation of stable homes and urban settings. Now, this is already clear in the first excursus, but the importance of Africa as a space for colonists to establish territorial boundaries is also the subject of the second digression of the Bellum Jugurthinum, which relates the story of the creation of Africa's eastern frontier at the border with Cyrenaica, and these are the so-called altars of the Philaeni. As the story goes, when the Cyrenians and the Carthaginians were fighting over the territory in the region of the Syrtis, they stipulated a truce, and they agreed that both cities would send envoys towards each other on a given day, and that the place where they would meet should be regarded as the common frontier of the two people. Sallust writes that the envoys from Cyrene were slower, for whatever reason, than the two Carthaginian brothers called Philaeni, who were sent off from Carthage, but that the Cyrenians, not owing up to their defeat, accused the Philaeni of having left ahead of time and required from them to be buried alive on the spot as a condition to retain the boundary. The Philaeni accepted this condition, and they sacrificed themselves from their country on the spot that was later consecrated by Carthaginians with the altars. Now, much can and has been said about this anecdote, but what interests me today is that the settlers of this boundary, who are Carthaginians, but whose name has a Greek form and etymon from phileo and ainos, meaning something like lovers of glory, are again not autochthonous Africans, but external colonists. The occasion for this second digression is provided by the foundation of the city of Leptis Magna from Phoenician colonists of Sidon, and this is presented as the institution of a clear geographical coordinate in this land's otherwise metamorphic landscape. It's a firm middle point between the relentlessly sweeping Syrtis. And Sallust goes on to explain the alleged Greek etymology of the Syrtis, which is from the Greek verb suro, to drag along or to sweep, trao in Latin, by giving us a full picture of epic coloring of the danger that these Phoenician colonists must have faced when being dragged onto the African coast. So he writes, there are two inlets almost at the very end point of Africa, unequal in size, equal in nature. The parts of them closer to the shore are very deep. The remaining parts, just by chance, are either deep or full of shoals, depending on the stormy weather. For when the sea begins to swell and to rage with the winds, the waves drag along mud, sand, and giant rocks. Thus, the appearance of these places changes together with the winds, and it is from this dragging that they are called syrtes. This brief ekphrasis stresses the role played by chance, force, and stormy weather, tempestas, in the continuous transformation of the metamorphic African landscape, with the asyndetic syntax matching the dissolution of borders by an almost exaggerated use of assonance, repetition, and elision. So if you look at the Latin, uti forstuli tal talialin, mare magnesset, limare namquet saxingentia, he writes. In his narrative of the story of the Philaeni, Sallust shows how the same combination of chance, casu, and stormy weather, tempestas, causes havoc on land as much as on the sea. For when the wind starts blowing and picks up sand from the ground throughout that flat and barren region, the sand is driven with great force and customarily fills the mouth and the eyes. The African landscape is presented as both ripe for military conflict and ready to be given geographic and political organization by outside parties. When the Carthaginians and the Cyrenians are at war over this territory, it is the sandy and uniform field in between them, ager in medio, arenosus, una specie, that causes strife over its boundaries because it lacks natural frontiers, such as rivers or mountains, that could help divide it into political regions between the colonists. Now, leaving Sallust and rushing ahead and southeastward to the Neronian era and to the Ethiopian frontier, similar features of indefinability can be found in an anecdote from Seneca's Naturales Questiones that recounts an expedition ordered by Nero to Africa to retrieve the mystery of the sources of the Nile. Now, while Seneca's purpose in this passage is supposedly of a natural scientific kind, so he wishes to demonstrate the existence of underground rivers for the larger purpose of explaining the causes of earthquakes, I think the passage is telling of both Nero's expansionist politics and of Seneca's use of geographical imagination to expose the limitations and yet the necessity of such politics for the very existence of a Roman Empire. So he writes, in fact, I heard 2 centurions who were sent to investigate the source of the Nile by Caesar Nero, lover of all virtues really, but more than anything, a lover of the truth. They were narrating of the long journey that they made when, after receiving help from the king of Ethiopia and being recommended to the neighboring kings, they penetrated to even more distant regions. After many days, they said, we came to immense swamps, the way out of which neither their dwellers knew nor can anyone hope to know. The plants are so entangled in the waters are so impossible to conquer, either on foot or by navigation, that this muddy and overgrown swamp cannot carry anything except a small boat, large enough for one. Here, one of them said, we saw 2 rocks, out of which came the powerful force of the river. The historicity of this anecdote is confirmed, or may be confirmed, by a parallel passage of Pliny's natural history, but there are significant alterations. Pliny speaks of a party of Praetorian troops under the command of a tribune whose exploration was ordered by an already warmongering emperor in his wish to add a war against Ethiopia to his fields of battle. Nero's thirst for knowledge in Seneca acquires a distinctly bellicose vein when read in the light of his warmongering in Pliny. Pliny specifies that this territory is up for grabs for Roman imperial conquest. intravere autem et eo arma Romana, at least since the times of Augustus, and he goes on to mention some of the conquests made by the prefect Publius Petronius. He presents this portion of Africa as a theater of war, as almost all the places that he had mentioned in the previous section had been reported by the Neronian party to be nothing but desert, certe solitudines. Now, in Seneca, this military context is missing. The Africans are presented as pacified and on friendly terms with the Romans. The centurions appear to have received help from the king of Ethiopia that we may take to mean the king of Meroe, which would be another incongruity with Pliny's text, who specifies that Meroe was being ruled by a Kandake, a queen whose title was Kandake. And Seneca writes that this king happened to recommend the centurions to the neighboring rulers. But the centurions' superior attitude towards the local inhabitants of this tract of land is betrayed when they start expressing themselves in direct speech. And you have it in the Latin here, when they say, "We came to immense swamps, the way out of which neither their dwellers knew, nor can anyone hope to know." On the surface of it, the centurions exaggerate the labyrinthic quality of the swamps by implying that nobody, not even the inhabitants, can even hope to know how to find their way out of them. And this is in line with the rhetorical tone of Seneca's passage, which casts the centurions' approach to what they take to be the sources of the Nile in full epic coloring. Emphasis is added by the sudden dramatic shift to direct speech, so it opens with a verb, pervenimus, whose tense must be perfect in symmetry with vidimus, which is further down. But in prose, pervenimus can also be mistaken for a present, so it furnishes the passage with a very dynamic, dramatic effect. The centurions also use Virgilian adjectives of size, of the kind meant to elicit sublime feeling, immensas, ingens. They also use rare and poetic vocabulary, such as the hapax legomenon eluctabilis, or the rare and almost poetic absolute use of the participle obsita. For Arturo de Vivo, the centurion's linguistic novelty has the specific goal of building up a semantic of the unknown. But the vocabulary also makes the scene evocative of the descent to the underworld as described in Virgil's Aeneid, which is presumably another proof of the existence of subterranean lakes and rivers, symbolized at the start of Aeneid 6 by the image of the labyrinth. The journey takes Aeneas and the Sibyl through an immense grove down to the Stygian swamp, where the way in is easy, but the way out is almost impossibly arduous. The centurion's notation that no one may even hope to know the way out of the swamp is thus part of their picturing of the journey as a heroic descent to hell. And yet, since the centurions clearly did find their way out of the swamp, the passage also implies that none of the indigenous inhabitants knows the way out, nor can any one of them ever hope to find it. The locals are portrayed in their utter lack of epistemic power, inhabitants of a land whose mysteries they do not know, nor will they even have the potential to know. They are akin to the ignorant prisoners of Plato's cave, portrayed in Virgilian terms as the ghost shadows of a hellish territory lying at the edges of the known world, a territory that lies in between earth and water, overground and underground, life and death. Now, of course, this portrait of the helpless natives is presented by the centurions and not by Seneca himself. Seneca, in turn, seems to cloud the centurions' epic journey in irony, because the spring that they think that they have discovered at the end of the journey is, in fact, Seneca will go on to say, not the source of the Nile. At the end of the day, however, Seneca is uninterested in the business of the origin of the Nile. The point of his anecdote is to prove that scientific phenomena are not always discernible by the human eye. What he's suggesting to Lucilius is that the centurions and the Caesars before them, both Nero and Julius Caesar, who in Lucan shows the same desire to find out the sources of the Nile in imitation of Alexander the Great, they are the ones who are akin to the ignorant men inside the Platonic cave, because they are the ones who confused scientific and philosophical knowledge with the autoptic experience of the military commander. In this passage of Naturales Questiones, Africa features as a land whose desert landscapes and unknowing inhabitants make it possible for the philosopher to exploit it as a sort of blank slate onto which to test and project Roman virtue and vice in equal measures. Now, while some historians have suggested that the passage may be located in the vast South Sudanese swamp known as the Sud, from the Arabic sad, which means barrier or obstruction, The two rocks from which the centurions believed to have witnessed the source of the Nile are actually very close to the description of the so-called veins of the Nile around the town of Philae, which are described in the 4th book of the Naturales Questiones. And as such, again, they end up casting doubt upon the reliability of the centurion's account. Moreover, the muddy and overgrown swamp, Limosa et Opsita Palus, is also reminiscent of the marshes around the Nile that were described by Seneca in his lost treatise on the geography and on the sacred rites of the Egyptians. Servius, who was the ancient commentator to Virgil, is reminded of this work by Seneca when commenting precisely on the Stygian marshes of the Virgilian underworld, and he finds the original Stygian swamp again around the town of Philae, presented by Seneca as difficult to traverse because of being muddy and overgrown with papyrus. So there is a direct triangulation, I think, between the description of a swamp at the very edge of the known world, the waters around Philae, and the underworld marsh of the Styx, where the shadows of the dead converge. Yet it has long been recognized that in another passage from Naturales Questiones 4, Seneca seems to confuse Philae, which is located just above the first cataract, with the region of Meroe, which is instead much further down between the 5th and the 6th cataracts. Seneca's oversight, or rather perhaps his conscious adjustment of geography, may have a rhetorical effect. The speaking place of friendship and reconciliation, Philae, Amicae, becomes the symbolic border between Egypt and Ethiopia in Seneca, as well as a symbolic cradle of civilization. The name is also reminiscent of the Philaeni and of their Arai, so another African territorial division symbolic of reconciliation. For Seneca, this recollection at Philae, where the Nile recoils after having traveled through great wastelands and having spread out into swamps, creates a direct opposition between the last portion of Egypt and its neighboring Ethiopia, where the Nile continues his course next. The Naturales Questiones had already imposed a clear boundary between Egypt and Ethiopia, and Ethiopia had already been presented as a land of dry deserts with very few springs and an ardent weather. Seneca portrays the region as a desert landscape, indulging in a kind of pathetic fallacy when describing its lands as lying abandoned and thirsty, quick to drink from any little water that they may receive from the sky. So to conclude on Seneca, I think that Seneca needs Ethiopia to be a land separate from Egypt, whose very barrenness and hostility to humankind can test the limits and endurance of Roman military virtue and of thirst for knowledge. In this respect, his use of Africa is very close to that of his nephew Lucan, who in Book 9 of the Bellum Civile will exploit the barrenness, harshness, and shapelessness of Africa to test and reflect upon Cato's Stoicism in an epic rendering that is very much in line with Seneca's use of Africa as a landscape of allegory in another one of his works, Epistle 104. And I have no time to talk about these texts, but they are very relevant to my project. So presented as an almost upside-down, hellish version of the fertility and civilization of Egypt, Ethiopia in the Naturales Questiones becomes the geographical and epistemological threshold that both Nero and Seneca need to sustain the aggressive thirst for conquest of a nation that is at risk of imploding if it doesn't engage in a continuous renegotiation of its borders and its empire of knowledge. So I focused on two examples of spatial and geographical description, but I anticipated that geography and ethnography are very difficult to disentangle, especially in a culture that relies on environmental determinism. So in the very little time that remains to me, I wanted to briefly show that when geographical knowledge verges into the unknown, there is the possibility for the wonders and the potentially monsters to emerge. In the invention of Africa, Mudimbe is struck by the presence of dehumanized beings in what he calls the geographies of monstrosity that are described in Greco-Roman texts and are localized, though not exclusively, at the edges of Africa. We find these geographies for the first time in Herodotus, but they only become truly reifying in authors such as Pomponius Mela or the elder Pliny, whose account of Africa is openly subordinated to the relationship of specific African communities with Roman power. So Herodotus places his geography of monstrosity westward of the Tritonian lake, which is probably not far from the Lesser Syrtis, and functions for him as an important divide between nomadic populations on the eastern side and sedentary populations which cultivate the soil on the western side. Partly, this is a geography of the unknown. Herodotus claims to refer hearsay from the Libyans themselves, and he ends up suggesting that a portion of what is heard may be of their own invention, when implying that some of these creatures might have been katapseusta, fabulous or invented. He reports that further westward, the territory is full of wild beasts, some of which are clearly animals, such as huge snakes, lions, elephants, bears, asps, horned asses, which are kind of antelope, but some seemingly partaking of the human, such as the dog-headed and the headless, who have their eyes in their chest, as well as wild men and wild women. Now, the claim that his account originated from the Libyans is likely to be nothing more than a rhetorical device for diversion of historical responsibility, but we may not discard the specification of the source completely, given that the viewpoint that he claims to be presenting is that of the Libyans who cultivate the soil and who may have indeed held disparaging sentiment towards those who were unsettled or nomads. Now, Herodotus seems to be willfully ambiguous as to whether the dog-headed and the headless are to be considered human or not. Both follow, in fact, a list of animals, but since they are presented just before an explicit mention of men and women, the text invites us to turn back at the end of the sentence and to ponder whether they too may have been human after all. Now, both the dog-headed and the headless will reach the Middle Ages and modernity, not by Herodotus, but by the accounts of Pliny the Elder and St. Augustine, and they will become stock figures of narratives of conquest and exoticism in accounts both of Africa and of the New World. Yet it is impossible, I think, to ascertain what kind of connotations they may have held for Herodotus here, or indeed for the Libyans. We can think of the Egyptian god Anubis for an example of canine features related to the vine, as well as to animalistic traits. But when the headless reach the Middle Ages and modernity, they have become fused with an actual historical people, the Blemmyes. Now, the Blemmyes were first mentioned in Greco-Roman sources by Theocritus, and they were placed close to the Ethiopians of Meroe and the Upper Nile. They also appeared beforehand in Egyptian and in Demotic sources. Strabo reports that they bordered on the Egyptians and that they were subject to the Ethiopians. While evidence of the Blemmyes' opposition to the Romans is mostly dated to later stages of the Roman Empire, historians have had reasons to suppose that the Blemmyes posed a threat, or at least a resistance, to Roman expansion since the time of Augustus. Something happens, at any rate, between the account of Strabo and the later mention of these people in Pomponius Mela and in Pliny. In the close of Mela's first account of Africa, we find the Blemmyes, whose heads are absent and whose face is in their chest, accompanied by similarly marvelous people, such as satyrs and goat pants. In the natural history, which may either be dependent upon Mela or else derived from a common source, Pliny has had them transferred to a geography of the imagination around the river Niger, which is of dubious identification, but preserved by Pliny as a veritable anti-Nile in a geography of monstrosity that resembles a capsized Egypt again. Here, the Blemmyes, whom Pliny says are reported to have no heads, their mouth and eyes attached to their chest, accompany people who straddle between the human and the animal, the Aegipanas, the goat pants, whom Pliny claims to be half beasts, the Himantopodas, the strap-foots who crawl instead of walking. But they're also presented on a par with historical people such as Garamantes and Gamphasantes, who are made to appear strange in terms of costume rather than appearance. So the Garamantes do not practice marriage, but live with the women promiscuously. The Gamphasantes go naked and don't engage in battle. The Blemmyes now lie in a territory between history and fiction, and it is this tradition of them as a byword for uncivilized monsters to be found in faraway territories, which will be followed by Isidorus and St. Augustine, among others, that will take them, for instance, to feature on the front page of editions of Walter Raleigh's Discovery of Guyana at the beginning of the 17th century. So while Herodotus is moved perhaps by individual curiosity in his account of Libya, which of course doesn't rule out the possibility that he also implies a cultural superiority in his viewpoint, the African geographies of Mela and Pliny seem to reflect attempts at a systematic organization of knowledge that runs hand in hand with Rome's military efforts in the region. While Herodotus maintains ambiguity regarding the human statues of the creatures or people that he mentions, the Roman sources seem to superimpose fantastic creatures with historical African people who may well have offered opposition to Rome's cause. So to conclude, these marvelous geographies, combined with examples of representations of Africa as a landscape of the unknown and otherworldly, contribute to show that some crucial epistemic shifts surrounding the imagination of Africa took place between the end of the Republic and the First Imperial era, when we witness a reification and instrumentalization of the territory and its autochthonous people that is, I think, a pre-modern precursor to that idea of Africa, which Mudimbe saw as the ideological backbone of the European exploitation of the continent. A full picture of this story, however, should pay close attention, not just to these geographies of Africa, but to their later receptions and political instrumentalizations. The texts of the ancient ethnographers, especially Mela and Pliny, were used extensively, for example, by Portuguese royal chronicle Gomes Yanes de Zurara, the author of the Chronicle of the Discovery and Conquest of Guinea, which is one of the first texts to justify pseudoscientific racism and the transatlantic slave trade. Mela's choreographia, in particular, given his brief and portable nature, influenced early modern colonialist thought and chronicles after a copy of the text was brought from France to Italy by Petrarch and engaged with by other Italian humanists, such as Boccaccio. Portuguese captain Pedro Alvares Cabral, who landed on the coast of Brazil in 1500, owned and annotated a copy of Mela, and the first translation of the text into Spanish was produced by his accompanying physician and astronomer, a man called Joan Faraz. Now, clearly, the aims and context of these later instrumentalizations differed widely from the original text from which they were inspired. But the ethnographic gazes that they projected onto various African territories and people bear commonalities that I think are vital to recognize to bridge the gap between antiquity and modernity on the history of Western constructions of subaltern territories and identities. Thank you very much for listening.
Yes, thank you very much, Elena, for your inspiring lecture. And I think it's really interesting how you show that this imagining of this African landscape is both creating sort of this openness, but also this sort of otherness, and that both these elements of this landscape made it possible to project the imperialism of Rome, and actually how that also goes for your last example. So how this same sort of openness, but also otherness gave room or the possibility to inscribe something new in it. And I think that's very interesting. I'm really sure that this will have inspired many questions or suggestions also from the many people that have joined us online. Great to see you, great to see your names here. So room for questions here for the people joining us live. Also from home, if you want to ask questions, you can either put your questions in the chat, but you can also just sort of speak up. We will hear you here as well. So there are many possibilities to join us in a hybrid fashion. So who can I give the floor for a first question? We see hands. If not, I will give the audience some time to think about their questions. I do have a question. I was wondering at some point, I think at the beginning of the lecture, you explained also in the wars that were fought in Africa that there was also quite some resistance actually from the African people. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit on that. Also, of course, on the sources we have for this, because that's, I think, most problematic in this area of research, that we may only have, let's say, the triumphal lists, for example. But is there anything to say?
Well, I mean, obviously, like the Bellum Jugurthino, the case of Jugurtha is an important example of, and it has been read, right, as an example of a rebellion fighter from. Again, it's problematic that the source we have is Sallust, right, for that. So we do not have any kind of pro-Jugurthan or Numidian source about that. We have, we have the Fasti Triunfale, we have inscriptions. The case, I think, of the head of Augustus at Mero is really interesting. We do rely, unfortunately, I'm not an archaeologist or an epigraphist, so we do rely like on archaeological sources where we have to rely on archaeological sources, I guess, when trying to figure out this potential resistance. But I think it's not just about resistance, it's also kind of viewpoints, because I haven't talked about this, but the excursus, what fascinates me about Sallust excursus on Africa is that he says that this excursus comes from Punic books. And he says that these were the Punic books of a king Hyamsel, who may be Hyamsel the first or Hyamsel the second, probably Hyamsel the second. Whether this is true or not, we don't know. What does it mean that these books were Punic? Were they written in Punic? Lots of different ideas have been suggested. We know that Carthage had an important library, a vibrant literature, that the library of Carthage they were given, Pliny says, to the Numidian kings after its destruction. So are there traces of at least Carthaginian viewpoints? And that's also problematic because for me, at least, because Carthaginians are in turn colonialists, right? In this story, so I'm looking at autochthonous Africans. What do we know about? But I think the Fasti Triunfales must testify to this resistance. The Blemmyes as well, we know about them from the reign of Diocletian. We don't really know what happened beforehand, but I think, for me at least, it's interesting to see that they become these monstrous people in that period, and they were historical people, that those headless people that were talked about by Herodotus were in a completely different territory. They had nothing to do with the Blemmyes. What happens when does that happen? Why does that happen? So I think that is fascinating. But I don't know if we have anything. I think in Demotic, I may be wrong, but I remember that in Demotic sources we do have reference to resistance from the Blemmyes to the Pharaohs, and maybe also to the Ptolemies afterwards. Like there is that story as well that I'm personally unable to. So they were people who always had their territory, who always had to defend their territory, whether it was from the Ptolemies or then afterwards from the Romans when the Romans took over. So it is likely that they continued to offer resistance.
Thank you very much. Yeah, of course.
Thank you so much. That was so fascinating. I've lots of things I would love to talk about. One thing that came to my mind, I know of French officers who were recommended to read Sallust during the war. The conquering of Algeria.
Yeah.
Do we have other instances for that in the later period when Italy was also conquering parts of Africa? That would be a first question.
The co-organizer of the Conference on Classics and Italian Colonialism, Samuel Agbamo, has a really interesting article on the authors of the Philaeni, because they were like reinstated by Mussolini on that border, remade. So the story of the Philaeni brothers and it's a very ironic story, obviously, because the Philaeni are Carthaginians. So how do they become fascists in Libya is quite he's written a really interesting article on that for Sallust specifically. But I think there are other receptions. But I would be very interested, because the French case is interesting for both ways, because there are many reiterations of taking Jugurtha as this, from an Algerian context especially, I think, as this rebellious, the one who offered resistance to the Romans, who become a kind of proto-French, right? So I guess it functions from both sides of the story, though.
Well, I do not recall this from the top of my head, but I'm happy to give you the reference later on. And this idea of monsters living in Africa, more or less. I mean, some of these texts are, of course, very shocking. Is this also, are there instances of also justifying Rome's presence in Africa the way it was justified in the 19th and early 20th century? Both the French and the Italian governments and military very much justified their presence as we're bringing civilization, and then of course also the true faith that was an additional value, so to speak. But do you see in these ancient texts, apart from the otherness and the fact that they are depicted as wild, ferocious, inferior peoples, also the other side of it? So it's only good that we are here to civilize this part of the world, or is this a 19th century invention?
Yeah, this is a really great question. I think it's what I'm trying to figure out, because a lot of what we read can be translated with these ideas in mind, even though it may not be originally. So when you read Sallust, for instance, I think scholars, I'm still trying to figure out what I do think, whether there are kind of stages. There is a sense that Sallust describes the autochthonous as he's quoting specifically from Lucretius, just more or less kind of same era, when Lucretius is talking about primitive man, and he actually quotes Lucretius when he's describing the original Africans, which is difficult for us, I think, to read without having all these baggages about primitivism that, you know, are kind of post-colonial baggages anyway. So what is it happening? Because it's a kind of utopia as well. But yeah, there's people who were roaming, they were nomads. Clearly this fascinated but also threatened Greeks and Romans already in Herodotus. They did not practice cultivation, and the word for they are called inculti, or they're said to live in cultius. They're often translated in various languages as uncivilized. Literally that means they did not practice cultivation. But Sallust elsewhere in the Bellum Catilina, actually, he's talking about what some people talked about like stages of civilization, which I think are not as clear cut as they would be perhaps in the modern era, where he sees like first cultivation of the soil, then urban dwellings and navigation. And in the excursus on Africa, he relates this very strange myth that we don't find in any other source, this myth that he says I found in these Punic books, according to which it was the army of Hercules was in the west, and Hercules died in Spain, where at Gades, where there was actually like a well-known temple to Hercules, which was famous in the Mediterranean. So Hercules dies in Spain, and the Medes, Armenians, and Persians that had followed him in Spain crossed the strait and go into Africa, and some of them mix with the people. So he says that the Numidians are a mixture of the original Gaetulians and the Persians. He says that the Persians taught them to have stable dwellings, and they used their ships, the bulk of their ships, to make the very first dwellings, and this is the reason why this Numidian dwellings are shaped as they are. So there are these stages of, and the Medes also mix with the Libyans, and then they start calling themselves the Maori, which become the more. So there is this sense, yes, that they introduce these stages of civilization, but it's really interesting because none of them is Roman. And they are people who, you know, there's another story about Persians, etc., were also kind of othered, or so. I mean, the difficulty that I have, I think, is how do you not? So I have, like, for instance, in the text that I brought, also in Herodotus, you have the word agrios as wild, is often translated as savage. How do you read these texts without necessarily bringing in that kind of baggage of a number of things, yes, like the utopian savage as well, or the civilizing. I'm not sure, but I mean, we never have, I think, any, there isn't like a rhetoric of we are bringing civilization as explicit as that. But there is this idea, I think, especially in Sallust and in other authors, that there is and already in the Libyans themselves, though, that there is a distinction between those who cultivate the soil and the nomads, specifically the nomads, I think.
So it's also that opposition, and it adds another layer in this very persistent idea of geographical determination. If there's also Persian, but I don't want to monopolize the discussion.
No, but it's really interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. There were already other questions, and then we see that there's a question in the chat as well. But first, to Barbara.
Yeah, thank you very much. This was fascinating. I have been wondering whether you have some idea why these unusual creatures were almost all located, or why they are so particularly located in Africa. As far as I'm aware, other barbarian countries were not at all as populated with strange creatures as Africa was. For the East, one could say, you know, that those were countries which were already relatively well known. So, you know, for that reason, fantasies didn't run wild for those areas. But north of the Alps, that was very unknown territory with ferocious people and quite unusual. But we don't have the same number of stories around all sorts of strange creatures living in those parts of the world. So why do you think it is particularly Africa that
I'm not sure
that
it is
attracted this kind of imagination of very strange populations?
I may be wrong here. I need to kind of, I still need to my read, but I seem to remember that they are also located in Mela around the Black Sea as well. And the kind of there's this memories, and as well Scythians, and maybe in Britain as well. There are like some strange, maybe not the headless specifically, but they are not only enough, definitely around the Black Sea, I think. So I'm not sure whether, well, in Herodotus, in Herodotus they are in this region of the Tritonian Lake, but in Herodotus it's almost a passing thing. So they become, I think Pliny really makes them, Mela and Pliny really make them something. And clearly, I think there are strange stories, because Strabo says continuously, I'm not going to talk about those taumata. I'm not going to relate these stories about Africa. We don't know. And some of these is not believable. So he is referring to something that perhaps something we don't have. I mean, we know we don't have Posidonius, for instance, on Africa. So I'm not sure that in the ancient world they are. And in fact, they even in their modern reception, they are not only in Africa. Like they go into the New World. I think they're also in Marco Polo. They kind of travel around, so they're not specifically related to Africa. But I think.
Do you think the Egyptian pantheon might have contributed to that? You know, with its hybrid divinities.
That's what I was thinking, like when I thought, well, you know, Anubis is not a monstrous creature, right? But we are in a very different region. And the other thing is that, I mean, it's not, I don't want to take Herodotus like, you know, at face value, but if we do, then what do we know of like the interpreter that he had, whether they must have said, you know, those people were those head dog people, maybe it was just a way to refer to people and he made it literal or something like that. Or I think some scholars have also suggested that the people with the head in their chest maybe had shields that looked like gorgon shaped shields. So they had head in their chest. Some others have compared like images of baboons because they have the head a bit like that. They said, oh, maybe it's not referring to people. These are actually, because it's not clear whether they are people or animals, because he's referring to animals. Then there are these creatures, and then there's actual people, the agrioi. So yeah, I don't know if they make a case for Africa specifically. I think they make these people appear at the edges of the known world. So I seem to remember both at the north and at the east, and then obviously kind of the edges of Africa. So they are transferred. If in Herodotus they are next to the Tritonian Lake, at that point, that's a region that's well known. In Pliny, they go into Ethiopia, wherever the river Niger is, which some people have said maybe it's actually the Niger, which may not be, because we know that Ethiopia, it's mostly the region of Sudan, but they imagined Ethiopia to continue to stretch like this probably. So there was also Western Ethiopia, which would be kind of towards the Atlantic coast. So maybe south of the Getulians, again, we find Ethiopians. So maybe that is where he places them, at these edges of the known world, I think. That's the point. And then they become something of Africa, I think, in the early modern period and then in the colonial era. That is the shift that I'm trying to understand, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I had a question, is a follow-up from what Natalie was asking about bringing civilization to Africa, because your presentation made me think of an epigram, of a Greek epigram of the Gallon of Philip, where some lions from the Scatii, Nasamonides, Livion are brought to Rome, and it's addressed to a Caesar. And it belongs to some epigrams that where the Roman expansion seems to be linked to a taming of nature, natural forces. Some epigrams about how the Pyrenean fountains have been reconducted just to offer a bath spot for Caesar, or the sea also being tamed by a mole in Puteoli, and these kind of themes that you found. But I was wondering two things. One, regarding the epigram itself. So does it fit the geographies that you were mentioning to find?
So which period is the epigram?
Sorry?
Do you know which period?
So it belongs to the Gallon of Philip. It's anonymous, but Gowan Page in their edition, I think that it must belong to the Gallon of Philip, and therefore it must be, if we accept the traditional dating, before 40 AD. So between the second half of the 1st century BC and the early 1st century AD. But
okay, yeah, so it's Scythians and Nasamones. Sorry, because I don't have it in mind.
So my question regarding the epigram was whether it would fit the geographies.
Yeah, I would be interested to know about this.
And the second one would be maybe not about bringing civilization to the people there, but about taming nature or natural forces in the sources about Africa. Can we find something like that?
So what does he say explicitly on taming? Is that on the deserts and?
It's about bringing lions to Rome. And it's a child Caesar actually who brings lions to Rome.
Yeah, I haven't thought about animals at all, which I think maybe at some point I should, because they are clearly a big part, and also a big part of the reception, the whole context of, maybe there's something really interesting in Marshall as well, of this bringing, the bringing of the world, and taming, but also turning them into spectacle. So that would be really interesting. Afterwards, but it's something that continues. The Nasamones are really interesting. I haven't talked about much in this, but they are an interesting people in terms of, because they seem to live with very little as well. And already in Herodotus, there are strange stories about them. He said that they've all died because of a storm. It's not quite clear whether he thinks they have been wiped out by nearby populations. They reappear in Lucan, and they become, at least in Lucan, I think they are very allegorical for this sort of frugality of Africa in a period where this idea of frugal Africa matched like this kind of anti-Rome, because that is, Lucan and also Seneca's idea of the corruption at Rome that caused the civil wars to emerge, so that Africa become the nasamones are these people, the pauper, that will live with very little, and they have to tackle nature, especially like the storms. They are generally connected from Herodotus onwards to the deserts and the sandstorms. But I would, if you can tell me which the epigram, I would be really interested to know.
Thank you very much. I think we move to the question in the chat here by Angelo Cataneo. Many thanks for the lecture. 2 questions, I think. You highlighted the continuities, the literary tropes that originated in the classics, but what about any medieval, early modern discontinuities instead? And I think the second, I also wonder if you could say more about the Portuguese reception of the classics with respect to Africa.
Oh, thank you.
You can read the questions.
Well, I haven't really started to do any research on Portuguese reception. I was interested in the Zurara because for me that was like an evident case of someone who was making very different points, I think, about Africa, but that's a text where actual what we call a kind of modern racism is a thing for that text. So that's it's explicitly talking about people who are inferior to us, but then he is often, both for the landscapes and for some of the things he said, is often referring back in that text to the ancient authors. Another interesting text that I would like perhaps to look at, as I said, I'm not an expert, is Luis Camões, Los Lusíadas, and the way in which, again, there are already racist ideas about Africa that are conceptualized onto especially representations of geography and people as well that come from especially Virgil and Lucan. So he's rewriting this new epic, this Colombian epic, and I think the story is really fascinating. I'm pretty sure that there must be so much more, if anyone knows, I'm not sure if this is like the job for me to do, but it's something that I definitely want to keep in mind. So if there are any other texts that are relevant to this.
I think it's certainly, I think, the type of research that's really open for collaboration, among other things, with our project on the classical roots. So I think we'll be very interested to share texts and ideas. So there was a question here.
So a lot of the literature that is responding to Mudimbe's work sort of argues that ideas about Africa, inventions about Africa, are never sort of single-handedly created and then imposed.
Yeah.
And these are scholars who are really sort of looking at how is knowledge created through interactions? How is that knowledge? How does it travel from Africa to Europe? And so I was just wondering whether it was possible for you to also sort of unpack those knowledge pathways. I'm asking this from the perspective of a modernist who has way too many sources.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering to which extent you could do that as well. You said something about someone's interpreter.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering to which extent that could also give insight into the contents of the text.
Well, no, thank you. I think this is really, I think what is interesting about Mudimbe is that he is a classicist, and so he is used, so he's, I think, as you're right, like this idea of this not uniform, but as if sort of almost schematic idea of Africa, as if this was a monolith, which it isn't, right? But a lot, I think, of what he is thinking about reflects what he's finding in the sources. And perhaps, I think, to an extent, he's also responding to a certain discomfort with the kind of work that Frank Snowden especially, I think, has been doing, because there was already, I think, a response to this idea that we should focus only on the discontinuities, right, between the ancient and the modern, and this idea that there wasn't a color prejudice, this kind of almost colorblind world that Frank Snowden created. And I think some of it, at least as it pertains to the ancient text, I'm interested in Mudimba actually responding to that and saying, well, actually, some of these texts say pretty awful things about Africa, and they must have filtered. And he says he doesn't really do that job. He says this is still a desideratum to understand how these texts have been have contributed to creating this monolithic image, which, as I said, it's not really my take when I look at the ancient sources. I think it's really, that's why I'm so fascinating with Sallust, because I think that there are so many traces of other perspectives that somehow filtered into Sallust. Quite unsure why. We have these authors who have just very different, like, for instance, the Excursus of Sallust, it's very, very brief. It serves a purpose in the narrative, because that's the point where in the narrative, Adherbal and Jugurtha have their different spheres, and Jugurtha is going to win. And he's telling, I'm going to tell you now why Jugurtha is going to win, because this is sort of ingrained in the African territory, because the Gaetulians are the original Persians and they're stronger. So, you know, it has a purpose in that particular point, but if you extract it and then make it something else, and that's the same with Seneca. Seneca is, you know, you have this anecdote, which sounds like Apocalypse Now to us, but when you read it in its treatise, it is talking about, you know, all this idea that this difference between what is actual philosophy, what is scientific knowledge, what is false knowledge. Those are the things that interest him. So I agree with you that I think I'm interested in seeing how these texts can be extrapolated and be made to become monoliths, or to be made to partake in in views that are more monolithical, but they actually, you know, they're partaking in different conversations at the same time.
I saw a hand here.
Yes, thank you for a fascinating talk on a fascinating part of the ancient world. I wonder, during your lecture, perhaps for the ancient viewer or explorer, would it have also have been a landscape of myth? For example, I thought of like the epitheton of, I think, Athena, which is Tritonia, which should relate to Lake Tritonis in Northern Africa. So might they have also viewed Northern Africa as a landscape that was connected to, at least to the ancient gods?
Okay, I wasn't aware that Tritonia.
I think it's in Ovid, maybe already.
I know the epithet, but I've never connected to the lake Tritonis. Why would that?
Yeah, I don't know what she would be, but I remember from my lectures, from the commentary, that it said that most probably it's a epithet coming from Lake Tritonis. Yeah.
Okay, I'm not sure. Maybe there is something in Apollonius of Rhodes, which is it's another big text that I would like to tackle at some point, because that's obviously has a lot of this mythical imagery of Africa as a land of the Argonauts. And you know, there's this whole passage of the Argos going through Lake Tritonis. There are so many interesting stories there, especially the Garden of the Hesperides, where we have, it's a sort of almost proto, you know, if you read it like with sort of kind of colonization ideas in mind, you have Hercules, which has violated this territory. You have the Hesperides crying about, just the Argonauts found them just after they've met this violent monster who's supposed to be the hero of civilization. And that's an incredible text that really problematizes what all the civilization myths in the landscape of Africa. And I think that filters really interesting into maybe not so much the geographers, but definitely the epics. So I definitely wanted to do something from Apollonius to Lucan and Virgil, because there is a lot of reception in that respect. Sallust also has this myth. It's clearly like a myth of you know, the origin. It's a myth that for him is the same in the Jugurtha that he has in the Bellum Catilinae, because in the Bellum Catilinae he has it with Rome. So that's it's a parallel myth to the Trojans arriving in Rome. He has it with the Persians, Armenians, and Medes arriving in Africa, which is super fascinating for all sorts of reasons. So yeah, it's definitely a territory of kind of Hellenizing myth. I don't know how much we can find in terms of kind of Aboriginal myth and culture and that kind of thing, and I'm not 100% sure. The lotus eaters as well.
So was Zeus visiting the Ethiopians?
Yeah, it has the
Iliad?
blameless. Yeah, in the Ethiopians in Homer are. He mentions them both in, well, they're mentioned both in the Iliad and in the Odyssey, and he calls them blameless, and they're this kind of fantastic, not fantastic, but they're almost, because they are like, he calls them always happy, and they're always feasting and always making sacrifices to the gods. He calls them like the most beautiful of the humans as well. That's in relation to Memnon. And they are the ones where the gods go when they want to chill. They go to the Ethiopians because they offer them like a great feast. So they're kind of in between a real civilization and a kind of, and a fantastic one. And some of those characteristics, I think, continue in the Ethiopian logos of Herodotus, which is kind of more real in a sense. But this continuous feasting, the feast of the sun, are part of it as well. Although I think that in Herodotus, when he goes to the Ethiopians, the spotlight is on the Persians. So they're kind of used as for me at least, they're kind of used as because it's the Persians, so the spies of Cambyses go to the Ethiopians, trying to understand whether, because Cambyses want to know whether he can send an expedition to Ethiopians and conquer them as well. And the Ethiopians read through, they give them gifts, and the Ethiopians read through all of these gifts. They say like there's lots of guile in the Persians. So I think he's less interested in the Ethiopians themselves than in continuing to comment on the Persians. But yeah, sorry, that was a long.
Thank you very much. If there are no further questions here in the audience or at home, I think we can close off this research dialogue, but not before thanking again Elena, Giusti, for your thought-provoking lecture. And also thanks to everyone here present and present online for discussing and exchanging ideas with us. I think it was clear that your lecture and the topic evoked many questions and discussions. So thanks for that. We here in the room or on the terrace will have drinks with our speaker. Maybe people at home will also have a drink after having been with us. We will be back with a new series of research dialogues after the summer from September onwards. So please keep a close eye on our website or subscribe to our newsletter to see when and what topic will be discussed then. Of course, we will not be closed during the summer, but I think there are no public lectures to announce at this point. I'm looking at my colleagues. No, I think not during the coming weeks. We will be back, as I said, for public events in September. Thank you very much and have a nice evening.